All right, everybody, welcome to our regular building committee meeting, August 9th. We're going to call it to order at 6:02. Nancy, you have attendance, I take it?
I do.
All right, thank you. Old business, we've got minutes from July 26th. Anybody have any corrections? Let's see if anybody has any corrections before I acknowledge a motion. I don't see any. All right, motion from Bob Ike to accept the minutes, seconded by. You have a second, Patrick raises his hand.
Yes.
Patrick.
Second.
Okay. All right. All in favor of approving the minutes, please signify by saying aye.
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 Any nays? Okay, motion passes. Thank you.
And one abstention.
One abstention. Thank you. Okay. So we have project updates from everybody. Just a reminder that we're still on target for providing the town council with whatever information they might need for their meeting coming up on Monday. We're looking for a couple of things to happen at that meeting, as we've recommended to them already. Number one, that they take the next steps in approving a November referendum for additional funding. And number two, that they approve going forward with the Prosser Library project. So those are our two goals that we've voted on. Why don't we go to Downs? We've got, let's see, we've got in no particular order, we've got Anthony, Tom, and Scott.
Yes, good evening,
Cheers, guys.
everyone. Nice to see everybody. So we've been working pretty diligently on not only our scope reviews, but our value management with the design team and the bidders. And we have been putting together our list to get to our $750,000 savings for Prosser Library without compromising, programming and the integrity of the building this past week and a half here, or almost 2 weeks. We've actually surpassed that number to $813,000. So we have an overage of $63,000 where we're under, which is good. So this fits with the scenario that was presented to the council, 2D, for the $10 million for additional funding required to be able to move forward with McMahon. And, this is including the value engineering. So what we wanted to do is, what we have done is taken order of magnitude budgets from the contractors based on items outlined in this list on the left here. And we've gone through it with the subcommittee, and you'll see these status codes. And a status code 2 is something that is recommended, where status code 3 might still be pending because we don't have the price yet, or it's something that we're still looking at with the design team on how to go through the design of a certain item that you'll see. And item 4 is rejected where it just didn't make sense for what was designed already and what's intended for the library. So Mark, you want me to just kind of touch upon the items?
Yeah, please, let's please share them all.
Yeah, okay. All right, so the first item, I've sorted them by the items that were recommended, and then that's not what I wanted to do. Let me scroll. And then as we go down, you'll see there's pending, and then the items that really didn't make sense for the project. Okay. So the first item we had was reviewing the manufacturer of the bridge. So there was a specific manufacturer contact that the steel contractors bid on for the project, and it was pretty expensive bridge. It was $1.1 million just for the bridge itself, never mind any of the decking that goes on it. And we looked at Bridge Brothers, who was also reviewed in the estimate, and there is a savings realized by using a different manufacturer of $435,000. So it's pretty substantial. And it does make sense based on their qualifications and their history of building pedestrian or erecting pedestrian bridges. So that was one major item that we hit. The next item was a small item for wall tile in the bathrooms. There was a small savings there. If we took away wall tile and repainted the walls, or just painted the walls rather. It still had a tile floor with a cove base, tile base, it's about $2,000. We looked at reducing the fire rating of the fire rated aluminum window frames and window systems down to 96 square feet. I believe it was somewhere near 350 square feet originally, or 400. And that was a significant savings of $85,000. So you're seeing more wall than you are with the windows. And this is mostly in the garage area where you go up the ramp to the elevator. And then in stair one, on both of the levels, there's a viewing glass. So that was a pretty good savings there. Providing storefront in lieu of windows, and I should say fixed windows. So on the back of the building, on the second floor, you have fixed windows that overlook the Riley parking lot. And if they're made and constructed out of storefront, there is a savings of $26,000, and you're still getting a good window. It's just made differently. So that was from the storefront subcontractor. Moving on to electrical, we came up with an idea of using aluminum feeders versus copper in the building. And that was a savings of $16,000. There's still an opportunity, maybe gain a couple more $1,000 based on a review of the engineer. This was a small savings for downsizing the conduits, number 20, going to the roof that feed the future PV system, the solar system. There was $3,000 there. In the front of the building, on the coming up to the front entrance at the ramp, there's a Wagner lighted railing. It's a system that the electrician buys in their lighting package, and it's very expensive. And we figured substituting it for a normal metal railing with a light strip under it and realizing a $40,000 savings there. So that's something that we're definitely into. In regards to some site work with the patio, we looked at, you had a concrete patio with pavers inset into the concrete. So if we remove the paver bandings and replace it with just straight up concrete throughout the whole patio, there's almost a $40,000 savings there. The plantings. So the engineer is actually looking at reducing some of the plantings, but we found during our scope review with the landscaper that they had missed an addendum that came out during the bid that actually reduced some of the plantings due to some civil changes. So they provided their number, and that was about $4,400 worth of savings. There was a reduction in waterproofing on the concrete foundation that the architect put together that they believe may not be warranted or is not warranted. It was about 86 feet, and that was $20,000 savings, approximately $20,000 savings. There's a DFIS, which is a direct applied stucco under a overhang into the entrance of the building. This number we're still investigating with the mason. That's why it's highlighted in yellow. We need to really verify that number in the quantity and the square footage. So that number actually may go down a little bit, something we're still going into. For the painter, there's a Thermaco coating on the steel, particularly in the porch area. So the design team is just looking at the porch area for now, and that had a $20,000 savings, so that was pretty significant. There was two items, 32 and 33, where we had some multiple layers of drywall and some walls that weren't really required for review of the architect. So I had $10,000 and $15,000 savings there for a total of $25,000. There was a reduction in millwork, about 87 feet of millwork, which is still under review. But the mill worker came back with a budget of $27,000 in reductions. So that was significant. Still in the accept recommended items. So the plaza stone.
So just to interrupt you there, Scott. So the sum total is all those item twos, those accepted items.
Yeah, $813,000 in this column right here.
Okay, so that's
so if it's number two, it gets moved over into the recommended column.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yep. If it's a number 3, we haven't moved it anywhere yet.
Okay,
We're waiting to see what we're gonna do with it. And then if it's a number 4, it'll get moved into this rejected column, which is right here.
okay.
And the last item for recommendation was the retaining wall at the front of the building. It had a stone facade, and just finishing that with concrete smooth finish. And that is yielding about a $45,000 savings, also very significant. For the items we have pending, we have the snow melt system alternate, which is an add, something that we're looking to add to the bridge. We're not quite there yet. You know, we are over the $750,000 we estimated by 63,000, still have 40 to go. But we may have some more deducts coming our way based on some items I'm going to go over here. Changing the birch wood species to pelam for the millwork. That's for the cabinets. That yields $11,000. That's being weighed out. The laminate is a stronger material, can hold up to more abuse than wood. But that's something the design team wants to look at further. Deleting the sun control devices. Those are the fins that are on the back and the front of the building. They're at the windows and the curtain wall to help shade some of the sunlight coming in from the sunset, sunrise. And that's $200,000, but it's been determined that that does take away from the building. So possibly looking at a reduction of the fins or an alternate manufacturer to attach to the building that may be a more cost-effective manner is being looked at right now. Deleting the ducting infrastructure for the range hood. We just haven't received that pricing yet for item 18. Looking at different vendors for lighting packages, that's in the electrical subcontractor's hand. And that is taking some time. That is not an easy task. And hopefully early next week, we can look to see if we have any numbers on that. As I mentioned before, reducing the scope of the plannings with the design team. Richter and Segan is currently looking at that. We had some correspondence today. The bridge deck materials, that's using a different type of wood species versus IPay. That's with general trades. Reduction of storefront inside the building for the next 3 items. That's something that we're still going through between a couple of contractors. So that's taking some coordination. Actually 4 items. Removing the double width GFCMU in stair 1. So there's some false chases going on there that we may not, well, it looks like we're not going to need. So we are waiting on some pricing from the mason. Looks like I have a duplicate there with the light fixtures. Oh, that's a reduction in light fixtures. So again, that would have to be weighed out by the design team. I think we're looking to see about the lighting package first. Alternate design for the display cases. So the display cases are pretty expensive as they're custom made. There are display cases that you can actually purchase from manufacturers to install that still look nice, that a lot of buildings use that for a lesser cost. So that's something we were going to look at. And then the last item was some gripping for the decking on the bridge, abrasive strips with the general trades. And lastly, some of the items that didn't make sense, eliminating double width CMU at the wall stair at the lower level. There's brick encasements of interior columns that we don't want to really take away from the design on that. Replacing the structural wood glulam beams. So you have wood beams on the high ceilings that are exposed, and they go along wood panels, decorative plywood panels for your ceilings. If you replace the wood beams with steel, there is a significant savings, but you're losing out on the look, and you also have to kind of change up construction to still somehow fit wood panels. So there's a bit of an issue there with design and constructability. So we have here deleting the pedestrian bridge. That was kind of as I mentioned to the subcommittee, a nuclear option. If we couldn't get to a budget that if we delete the entire bridge, it's about $1.2 million. And, you still may need to have an alternate access, may or may not, to the porch besides on Tunxus Street. But again, it doesn't look like we're going to have to do that. So that's good news. Reducing acoustical wall panels, those are the sound absorbing panels on the walls. Trying to stay away from that just so we can keep the library quiet and minimize the echoing from the design. Removal of exterior signage. So there was $15,000 put in an allowance in the specifications for an exterior sign. No matter what, we're going to need an exterior sign, but between the design team and reviewing manufacturers and subs, I'm sure we can find an economical sign that still looks good, that can meet the budget. Alternates for wood trim, changing the custom wood ceilings to cloud ceilings in the community room. So we're going to keep that the way it is with the custom wood ceilings. We're going to look to do that. Changing the fire rated storefront to steel. That was another option for the fire rated storefront. It just turns out that, there was a better option up top with the $80,000 I lost. Right here, with reducing the square footage of it. So that just turned out to be a better option. Reduction in interior glazing. Again, some interior wall changes with reducing or changing up how the glass fits in the walls is another option that's up top. So that kind of replaces this. Eliminating concrete under the paver banding. That was only a reduction of 11,000, where if we just eliminated the banding altogether and did a concrete patio, you yield almost a $40,000 savings. So that was a better option than this. And lastly, eliminating the concrete patio altogether and installing stone with pavers. That actually turned out to be more money. Just having a paver patio, it's just a lot more labor intensive. So again, with the items that we're looking to work with, it is yielding $813,000 in value management. And I think that's pretty good. And we're going to look to continue with some of the pending options that we have here. And hopefully those come in next week. But I think we have plenty here based on the meeting that's scheduled on Monday with the town to review the scenario for moving forward with Prosser with value engineering and referendum towards McMahon.
All right, well, I want to thank you guys at Downs and TSKP and library staff for developing this so thoroughly and so quickly. And we've met the goal that you set here for Prosser, so that's very good news. Questions for Scott and Downs?
Yeah, Mr. Chair.
Glenn.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Scott, has it been taken into consideration cutting out the cost of one of the 3 boilers for the heating plant? That seems like overkill for redundancy, even if it's a cascading system. What is the need for 3 boilers?
So we have not considered that. And unfortunately, I can't answer that for you right now, Glenn. That I can certainly talk to RZ about, the engineer, the mechanical engineer, and see what their opinion is on that. We can certainly raise that question.
I just thought it might be a nice change off if we're forfeiting some of these desired aesthetics.
Yeah,
maybe to have a look at that. I don't know what the cost value would come in at, but I'm sure it's significant.
I'm sure it would be. I'm also sure RZ probably had a really good reason for putting it there. But we can certainly ask the question.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Glenn. Patrick.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Scott, great job, of course, on this. I did just want to clarify. So if we take all the number 3s and they become number 2s or recommended items, will that in fact increase the cost management savings?
Well, I hope so. That's the goal.
Right. But that
Yeah,
would be the
they're
goal,
pending. So they're pending savings, right? They're
yeah,
not pending ads, unless
right.
we get kind of thrown off by somebody. But
But I guess so. But what I'm saying is, we could in fact increase the total right now is the 813,901, which already surpasses what we thought we had to reduce by. So we would be able to further reduce that if some of those pendings become recommended.
Yeah, we would agree with that.
Okay,
That's the
okay,
goal.
and then, so I guess maybe this is a question for the chair, but are we looking for this committee tonight to approve the recommendeds, or is this just more for discussion?
Well, I think there's nothing wrong with us approving this. I think, again, our goal is to
Mhm.
take a snapshot in time here so that we can fix the number
Right,
of additional funds that we're asking for. And your question about the pending items is very good, because the intent is to keep going and,
Mhm.
and reduce costs as much as we can. But as I said, we got to take a snapshot in time here.
Yeah, so maybe it
Fix,
makes
you know,
sense to
ask,
wait.
ask for so much additional, and hopefully we don't need all of that additional as we continue to go down through this list,
Right,
and
Yeah.
do this. And my understanding also is timing wise, a question for you, Scott. I don't believe we're holding up anything at this point. In a critical path, you would be going through all this vetting with the contractors, all the trades anyways, and establishing, the total price of the job. And in the meantime, we still need approval to go forward with the job from town council. So this is not holding us up in any way. Is that correct, Scott?
Yeah, if we were to start next month, there's nothing on this list that I can see that stops us from being able to demo and go into ground improvements and concrete. So that, that even steel, that's a good thing, because the bridge is farther off in the schedule. We want to get our envelope enclosed before we get that bridge going, so it would just be in the way. So yeah, that would be correct.
Okay, thanks. Lois?
After looking at all of these changes, can you give me a ballpark idea of the extent to which they will affect three things? One, the safety of the building. Second, the durability of the building. And third, the aesthetics of the building.
I don't see the safety of the building being compromised. And maybe you're alluding to that because some of the fire ratings being reduced. You're just reducing interior windows that you can look through, you still have the wall that is keeping your rating that you're building back. And same with durability. I think that would go hand in hand. And what was the look of the building? I mean, what would really compromise the look of the building, if anything, is I would say the fins and maybe the stone wall, we can still have a really nice looking concrete wall. It's done all the time. And the fins, that's not something that's been accepted yet. And you may not need to, but, depending on, some of this overage and savings, if you can get past, $100,000, it's possible to try to work in that alternate that the subs figured for the snow melt system for the bridge, which I know is somewhat ideal for the town as far as looking to have that feature on the bridge.
Well, elimination of the bridge would also impact the aesthetics, correct?
It would,
That
that wasn't,
TSKP had advised, that's a key design component.
yeah, but that wasn't recommended. If it had been recommended, then, oh yeah, we'd be talking about that for sure.
Yeah, Scott, Richard can comment too on the aesthetics and
Oh, yeah.
the safety. I mean, nothing that has been recommended on this list affects the building code or compromises that in any way.
That sounds like a cue for me.
Yes.
So
Go ahead,
let me
Richard.
let me talk a little bit about the process that we went through. Remember that at the last committee meeting, we said we had our pencils up, that we hadn't really done any kind of detail revision in the drawings. But what we owed the committee was some level of confidence that the goal that was established of cutting $750,000 was achievable. And I'm convinced that it is achievable without compromising things like safety or aesthetics. And we looked at everything, and it was done with several people in the office, including myself and Taisu, and Deanna, who has spent a lot of effort in going through scope reviews and discussions with Downs. So no, I don't think there's any compromises in safety, no compromises in functions, and maybe there's a little bit of a compromise in eliminating the stone on the exterior wall near the front entrance. But that's something that we talked to planning and zoning about. I don't think it's a major change, honestly.
And I think at some point we were looking at stone at the exterior wall around the garage area as an
Yes.
option, which we did not pursue.
Correct.
So this stone would really be the only stone on the, vertical face down there.
Yeah, there was an alternate on that, so I mean, there's alternate pricing on it.
Yeah.
But, with what we're looking at here, I don't think you're gonna be able to get there.
I mean, I could see wanting to keep the stone if we were doing stone, elsewhere,
Right.
but we're not. So I think it makes sense to look at eliminating it. Allison?
Thank you. In looking at some of the details with TSKP on the reduction of the millwork, there are a lot of spaces internally or inside the building that we are compromising the aesthetic and the staff functionality. But we're hoping to make up for that if we're transferring some of this to FF&E. So instead of having some of the built-in features, we're hoping that some maybe freestanding furniture or other pieces could make up for it. But this is definitely less than we wanted it to be. So I just want to give our staff perspective on it. Thank you.
But you've worked with the architect in developing this list, correct? That's my understanding.
We are currently giving feedback back and forth.
Right. Okay. More questions for Downs? Okay, let's go on to TSKP. Richard and Deanna are here.
Deanna's the person who has been working very closely with Downs in developing that list of items. Deanna, I don't know if you want to make any additional comments. Scott has done a great job walking through all of these VE items. Anything you would like to add, Deanna?
Yes, just to add, this last week has been a lot of work between TSKP and Downs about the scope reviews and the value engineering items. And just wanted to point that out that yes, safety and durability are not affected, as Richard and Scott mentioned. A little bit of the aesthetics, maybe some of the changes inside, but we don't see any major items that might affect it. We're working with Allison and the staff about the millwork reductions, so I don't see anything major really that it might affect the functionality of the building, especially.
Right. Questions for Richard or Deanna? Let's, if I could just go back to Downs, and the other piece of this is McMahon. And Scott, maybe you want to explain where we're at with that, because our overall goal is $1 million of cost reduction at this point.
Yeah, so in the scenario, we had a savings there. The issue, as we've laid out previously, Mark, is that it's 250,000. Is that with the scenario that we're looking, well, everyone is looking to move forward with Prosser going forward and McMahon going out to referendum. It's quite difficult to pull from bidders from McMahon budgets on value management when the pricing is going to be expired by the time referendum happens, and the pricing money won't make sense anymore. So we are looking to take the avenue, of working with our estimators and TSVP on that particular budget and what management can occur for that building. So if, should everything go the right way on Monday, or the way it needs to go to move forward, I guess. When we put out another bid for McMahon, we'll have some updated drawings that will incorporate those savings and, hopefully yield what we're looking for based on a rebid for next year.
So with a Monday meeting being our goal, and trying to achieve the $1 million cost reduction, which looks like you're there. If you're comfortable with that additional savings at McMahon being possible, then I suppose, why don't we, rather than, I don't think we necessarily need to approve this, the VE list, but I think I'd rather just make sure we're all comfortable with what we're presenting to town council and what we have presented in that $10.3 million. Maybe you want to put that up again, Scott,
Yeah, sure.
the referendum amount that we would be asking for. I think that's what the target is here. What is that number, and are we comfortable with it?
Yeah, right there. Yeah, I mean, we're feeling pretty comfortable with it based on the response for this process, and that we're not even done yet.
You got the wrong share up.
Oh, do I? Oh. Right.
Yeah, because this is what has been presented to town council. And I guess we're safe in saying it stands, correct? That's
Yeah.
324.
Yeah, it's right here. My screen is locked. I can't highlight it, but
Okay, so I'm satisfied knowing we have a consensus on that. Lois?
I thought that I heard Scott say that we were not sure about the McMahon numbers because when we go to bid, that could all change.
what I'm saying, Lois, is that if we try to pull budget numbers from the McMahon bidders now for value management, the numbers will not hold up. And they will not hold up because McMahon will not be going to referendum, well, hopefully in November. And there's a 90-day expiration date on each bidder's bid, if you will. And so we're going to run out of time by the time that referendum happens. So, by going to referendum, you're qualifying and going to a rebid.
Scott, I think the question becomes, how do we know we're going to get that additional $200,000 out of McMahon? Are we going to just revise the scope that's in there, or are we going to wait till we receive bids and then value engineer the additional $200,000?
Well, as I mentioned before, Nancy, I think we want to try to attack that before we go back out today.
Okay.
Our estimators and our budgets and in collaboration with the design team, what savings can be realized from what's designed now to what we can move to.
Yeah, I think
We can collaborate with the committee as well, obviously.
But it becomes very important how this is described to the town council.
Yes, I understand.
Scott, I think it's important to know that we do have a list for McMahon that we've already started, right? So
If I were on the town council, I would like to know, what do you think is the outside additional cost for McMahon, given the uncertainties? And I would like to understand what those uncertainties are.
But I think at this point this evening, I want to know that you're comfortable saying we can reach this $1 million as presented here.
Well, based on what we've received and how it's gone in the past 2 weeks, we're feeling pretty comfortable that we can reach the $1 million between the two projects.
Yeah, Mark, I think that this effort has proven to us that these numbers are achievable. Because some of the items are very similar for McMahon, outside of the bridge and, some of the very specific items for Prosser. And a lot of the pricing is similar. So I could say with confidence that we're comfortable with the number.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but the 813,000 that you've already identified, as someone asked earlier, that number could actually go up just on Prosser alone, correct? Because you've got several pending items that may achieve some savings as well.
Yes, that's.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I was trying to say earlier too, Nancy, that we could reach that. If those pendings become recommended, we could reach that million, here
Yeah, on Prosser alone.
alone, right? On Prosser alone.
Right, right.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
there's items, with McMahon, that could even be considered FF&E as far as some of the millwork goes that are on rollers that are being custom built with some of the moving bookshelves and, the ceilings are definitely very intricate at McMahon, even more so, as far as acoustical properties go than Prosser. And again, not trying to take away anything from McMahon, but there's definitely items to look at McMahon to realize some savings. In the same manner as we had with Prosser.
All right, then, any other questions on this?
Mr. Chair, Patrick here. Just a quick comment for Scott. On your graphic that you had up earlier, Scott, if you're going to update that, the bar chart doesn't match the verbiage. So which is correct? Are we going to move into both, occupy both in April of 25, or will we occupy Prosser in April and McMahon in June?
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, so
It depends, Patrick, on what happens with referendum, and we could take a harder look at that.
sure.
Just keeping in mind that Prosser is a much longer project than McMahon.
Yeah.
But, there's a little bit of unknown there, depending on what would happen with the referendum or when that would take place. And that may be why we're showing that there.
Yeah, the bar chart is correct. There's just a typo in the description.
Okay, so then maybe it's just changing the verbiage to say that
Yeah,
you
I
occupy
think a
both.
lot of that, I think that's due to being able to have the referendum in November. I think the June start was if we had to wait until the spring to do the referendum.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Too,
right.
yeah, Chip, too many iterations of the
Exactly.
Yeah,
scenarios.
that's why I just wanted to,
Yeah,
clarify which one it is.
We
bar
did a lot
chart
of
is
samples.
correct.
Yeah. We did a lot of samples.
Yeah, thanks,
Okay.
Patrick, for noticing that.
Yeah.
Okay, so then, any other comments or questions? Otherwise, I'm gonna assume we're good with this, additional funding number shown there. Okay. All right, again, thank you for all that work. Let's go to Chip. Let us know what's happening with your end of the world there.
Yeah, so we've been working to try to get the emergency light situation at MetLife taken care of. Glenn has been taking the brunt of that, meeting with several contractors, getting pricing. So far, we have one price in, and that is to install new emergency light packs throughout. Unfortunately, that's one of the more expensive options and time consuming. So right now that is projected to be around $19,000 and up to a month of delay because of all the labor aspects of that. We are still working with some of the other electricians to try to get to tie in an inverter into the existing circuits. And then also I am going to go back to the owner and push to tie to the emergency generator, because ultimately that would be the easiest and the fastest. They are claiming that there's no capacity, but we have, indications that that may not be true. So I'll be pushing back on them to see if we can get them to allow us to tie into that emergency generator.
All right, questions for Chip? See any hands? Glenn, I want to thank you very much for all the time and effort you're putting into this. Couldn't do it without you.
Absolutely.
So we appreciate that very much. Always something. Yeah, not what we expected. So
No.
No. I mean, the space has some generalized emergency lighting, but it just doesn't have the specific emergency lighting to cover the entire space. That was the fire marshal who, when inspected, gave us that. So,
Right. And we were given no indication that that was an issue from the owner. So that's one of the reasons I will be pushing back on them, because, that's something that they should have known and should have let us know when we asked the question.
yeah, I understand our lease agreement is, the space comes as is, and we're going to be responsible to, for the improvements we need to make it work, which are specific to our layout. So, unfortunately, no one saw it coming.
Mhm.
All right. Well, thank you for that. Let's go to anything, Elizabeth, on outreach at this point?
Chair, I just wanted to elaborate on that as well. I know it's very disappointing that we are not opening BPL Atrium right now, but we are open at 330 Park for technology services. We've been serving many people there. That includes access to the internet with computers, scanners, fax machines, and staff to help there. We are also answering telephones and through BPL phone, and all of our programming is going on both virtually and in person. We're thankful for our partners in the schools for inviting us to summer school as well as leisure services with the camps. In June and July alone, I know we interacted with, I think, 3,500 youth and families, which is quite amazing during this time. So we are still very much open, but we are looking forward to, that last piece, which is, sharing collections. But as a reminder to our public, your library card works at all libraries. You can return materials at all libraries, and you can borrow with all libraries. And to get that library card, all you need to do is give us a call or write us an email, and we will send you your library card in the mail, and be able to give you that number immediately so you can access BPL online. So thank you, Chip, and thank you, Glenn, for helping us to get this last piece of the puzzle open for us and our public.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. Okay, let's go to Nancy with, you have invoices? Is that correct?
Actually, before that, I have an approval for a purchase.
Oh, you do have, okay, I'm
I
sorry.
do. I have one. It was buried in an email attachment that I forwarded. So those of you who don't see the word quote written anywhere might not understand it. It was titled Prosser McMahon Libraries, and it's a quote from GeoQuest, our neighbors across the street from Town Hall. And it is to do some window and door asbestos testing at Prosser for $600, and then some additional lead testing, lead-based paint screening of Prosser, Riley Lumber, and McMahon, and that would be $2,400. So the total would be $3,000. This is substantially less than the prices that we were being quoted from SLR to complete the work that they wanted to do. So I don't know if anybody has any questions. GeoQuest has done work for us on this project previously, and we've been satisfied with their work.
Moved by Mr. Ike,
Second.
second by Mr. White. Thanks, Jesse. Okay, all in favor of approving this purchase, please say aye.
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 Any nays? Motion passes. Thank you. Nancy, invoices?
Yes, I have three. First one is for Colliers. It's invoice number 869501. For $6,721.84.
Moved by Bob Ike, seconded by
Second,
Lois. Thank you. Questions, discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any nays? Motion passes. Thank you.
Next one is for Meyer, for moving services. It is invoice number 220-046-886. And it is in the amount of $52,175. And I will tell you, most of you didn't know this, I was getting daily updates from Myers as the move was going along. So I was very impressed by the communication. I know the staff and Chip can talk about their impressions of them, but from a communication standpoint, I was very pleased with them. So, I would entertain a motion to approve.
Moved by Bob Ike, seconded
Second.
by, I'm sorry,
Second.
second by Jesse. Thank you very much. Questions, comments?
Was this the,
Discussion?
one quick question, Chair. Was this the original, maybe it's for Chip, is this the bid amount that they bid for the move? And maybe Nancy, that's
Yeah.
if you know it.
I think the total purchase order was issued closer to $150,000.
The total's
Because
around
we-
that.
Right, because we included the moves back into the libraries.
Right.
Okay, so this is the portion of moving out.
This
and
is
not-
moving
oh,
out.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
And then finally, I have invoice number 250-104-6601.
We got to take a
Yes.
vote on, Nancy, we need to take a
Oh,
vote on
I'm
it.
sorry. I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Okay. Any comments on that one from Myers? If not, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any nays? Motion passes. Thank you. Okay, now last one.
I apologize. This one
No
is for
problem.
Downs Construction, for pre-construction services, invoice number 250-104-6601 in the amount of $26,870.
Moved by Mr. Ike, seconded
Second.
by
Jesse.
Jesse.
Thank you. Okay, questions, comments? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any nays? Motion passes. Thank you.
That's all I have.
All right, thanks, Nancy. So future meetings, I think we got a typo here. Next one is August 23rd,
You're correct.
and then we're into September after that, September 6th. Comments from the committee? We have comments from the committee. Elizabeth.
I just wanted to comment that we've been receiving a lot of feedback from the community and questions about everything that's going on. I know that I did put in an op-ed in the Bloomfield Messenger last week, and there were some other op-eds as well. And I just hope that everyone is continuing to share accurate information in the community about what's going on about this. In addition to that, a reminder to everybody that our updated hours and where we are open is always available online from our website, bplct.org. So if you hear any questions about when we are open, where we are, that's the place to go. And that's updated with real-time information as we have it. Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments from the committee? Going once. Twice. Okay, I see we have members of the public. Nancy, comments from the public.
Anyone from the public who wishes to speak, please raise your virtual hand.
I don't
Anyone
see-
from the public wish to speak? No one's hand is raised.
Okay, we thank you for joining us. Encourage your participation Monday night at the town council meeting. And with that, I will take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Ike, seconded
Second.
by Jesse. Thank you. All in favor, say aye.
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 All right, we are adjourned, and I thank everybody, and hopefully we'll see you Monday night. Take care.
Have a great evening.